Thank you everyone for joining today's session on youth of color and criminalization, a Plática for helpers.
Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Like Bella mentioned, my name is Ali Guajardo. I'm a licensed clinical social worker practicing out of Santa Barbara County. My pronouns are he, him. So just my career, my profession in a nutshell, I have been working in Santa Barbara County as a licensed social worker for the last 7 years with different programs, from wraparound, which is an in-home program providing crisis response with mobile teams here in Santa Barbara County. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been kind of specializing and working directly with LGBT populations, specifically transgender healthcare, providing individual therapy in that setting. But for this training today, I really wanted to just pull that up, let you all know that for this training, not only will I be pulling from my experience as a clinician in the field, but also as a Latino trans man who has navigated multiple forms of adversity in childhood, whether that was navigating the foster care system, living with and having parents that had unmet mental health needs and engaged in substances. So all of those experiences that I've went through, both personally and professionally, I kind of bring together in this room today to kind of share some knowledge and be in this room with you all. So definitely excited to be here with you all. And I will say, for this conversation, it's going to be very interactive, hopefully. So I encourage you all to lean into this vulnerability, be curious, and stay open and willing to learn. And I'll hand it over to Isabella.
Hi, y'all. So my name is Isabella. Y'all are welcome to call me Bella. My pronouns are she, they. I am a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow, which is a fancy way of saying that the UC system pays me to do research. I research the criminalization of Latina foster girls, but more generally, I look at the ways that things like race, class, sexuality, gender impact the lives of youth, and especially impacts their experiences with things like criminalization. So professionally, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, but personally, and the fun stuff is that I'm a queer femme from LA. I love flowers. I'm the child of migrants. I'm also the child of addicts. And when I say the child of addicts, really what I'm thinking about is I'm the child of people who had needs that were unmet, that did incredible work to create the human that is today. And when we hear addict, so many of us have these criminalizing ideas. And that's hopefully part of what we're hoping to unpack today. And really the reason that I do the research that I do is because I have a deep, deep love for my community. I have a deep love for youth of color who are navigating systems and societies and worlds that are a lot harsher on them than they deserve. And with that, let's get into our learning objectives.
All right, so for today, everyone, we're hoping we are going to get to learning how to apply an intersectional lens to the criminalization of youth. We're also going to learn how to identify and minimize the criminalization of youth of color.
And our agenda today, there we go. So we're going to define and discuss criminalization of youth. This is where your own insights and experiences are going to be incredibly helpful. Y'all have seen the way that criminalization plays out in real time in the lives of the people that you work with. And so we're really going to be relying on y'all to help us kind of unpack what criminalization means. And then we're going to move into a conversation about the impact of criminalization on identity formation. This is where Ali's going to bring in all of his little clinical magic and help us understand the way that something like criminalization impacts the way that youth see themselves. And then we're going to talk about strategies to minimize criminalization. And really what we're thinking about here is, as helpers, how do we ensure that we are not tools of harmful state practices? Most of us go into these helping fields because we have a love for our community. We want to help people. We have a love for people. And so how do we ensure that we then don't become kind of co-opted into this project of criminalization? And then we'll wrap it up with a case study and a question and answer session. Of course, y'all are welcome to ask questions throughout the session, but we'll have a dedicated period at the end for any questions that weren't answered. We're going to be starting off with a conversation about what criminalization means. So when we're thinking about criminalization, what we're really thinking about is the process by which behaviors and individuals are transformed into crime and criminals. And I want to note behaviors here. So this is previously legal acts may be transformed into crimes by legislation or by judicial decision. Criminalization is a process by which certain practices that had been legal are made illegal. And by defining activities that are associated with certain groups as criminal, those groups themselves come to be seen and treated as dangerous, often justifying extreme and subtle violence against those people. And we have so many contemporary examples of this, right? And one of the ones that comes to mind, especially when we're thinking about the ways that the process of criminalization makes certain communities seem as if they're overtly dangerous. And the example that comes to mind is the police brutality that we see faced by so many Black community members. And part of this kind of legacy of violence that is perpetuated against Black communities is because there's this misconception of criminalization, meaning that people are inherently dangerous, right? And what this example or what this definition is telling us is that criminalization is something that's constructed. It's not something that is inherent. It's not something that is natural. It's not something that people are born as. Rather, this is a social kind of agreement that we come into as a society, and we decide what is criminal and what's not. And so when we think about criminalization, really, for so many of us, one of the first things that comes to mind are things like prisons, policing, incarceration. And of course, that's a major part of criminalization. But when we're thinking about youth especially, and what the word cloud really shows us is that something like criminalization happens in all arenas of youth lives. Mm-hmm. A child doesn't need to be on probation or incarcerated to be experiencing criminalization. Like y'all mentioned, it happens in their schools, it happens in their communities, it happens in their home spaces sometimes even. And one of the other things that I really want to highlight about this definition is that it identifies criminality, again, not as something inherent or natural, but as something that is socially constructed, where things like laws and policies that are constantly changing ends up criminalizing and marking certain people and certain ways of dressing, for example, as something that needs to be disciplined. All right, next slide, please. We have a couple of examples to talk through. Thank you.
Yeah, so as we're kind of talking about these things not being inherent, that there's something that are constructed, I thought, just kind of specializing in transgender care, that I'd share some of these kind of bills that have been put forth. So there's so many examples currently right now that kind of display the ways in which was once legal are now becoming illegal for the purpose of like criminalizing people who fall outside of that gender norm. So these three right here are like anti-trans legislations, kind of banning drag performances, and making it really a crime to just kind of express themselves. But the one that really gets to me, or that stands out the most, is this one, the one in Tennessee, where the bill would make it illegal for a trans person to use the bathroom at the same time as a minor. So that bill would ultimately make using the bathroom while being trans illegal. Therefore, again, marking transgender bodies as criminal just for engaging in basic things like using the bathroom. Others examples that are on here kind of just include banning gender affirming care to children and adults. So like denying access to life-saving medications and procedures that then again, if we don't have access to these things, probably will engage in some informal way or illegal, right? If we talk to my doctor, illegal ways of obtaining like gender affirming care and medication. And, making it, like we said, like illegal for drag shows. And this has been like a long-standing practice and form of art that is now again kind of being deemed as criminal.
So really what these examples are showing us is that through things like laws, we and our lawmakers have the power to construct these activities that were previously, these really powerful art forms, for example, like drag. They have the power to convert them into something that is now deviant, well, it's always really been deviant, but something that is now criminal. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Because these examples are not something that only exists for drag queens or for trans folks. We also see the ways that criminalization through something like dress codes infiltrates all of the spaces that kids are in. Within school spaces, which is a space that obviously many youth engage in, that many youth are present in, and that many youth have to navigate. we see how school policies criminalize particular aesthetics or styles of dress, like hair or colors, or wearing your clothes in a certain way that are associated with racialized bodies. One of the examples that comes up relatively often is dress code policies related to hair, right? So in the ways that, for example, Black girls may wear their natural hair and be sent home and be forced to miss school classes because somehow their natural hair violates dress code policies. Or when I was in high school, one of the dress codes was, it was a limit on how big your hoops could be. So your hoops couldn't be larger than a certain circumference. And when we think about who wears hoop earrings, right, that aesthetic, especially when I was in high school about 15 years ago, that aesthetic was one that was especially used by Black and brown girls, right? And so these kind of arbitrary school policies that aren't necessarily laws, they aren't something that's passed by the federal government, but they are policies that youth are forced to contend with that mark their ways of dress, their styles, their personal, the performance of their, the ways that they kind of style their bodies as something that's criminal, as something that needs to be disciplined. And we know that when kids are pushed out of schools, they experience higher interactions with people like police, for example, which leads to more kids that are on probation, more children that are then officially caught up within the prison industrial complex. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say for this. So really what this is leading us to is what sociologist Victor Rios calls hypercriminalization, which is our next slide, please. So hypercriminalization involves constant punishment. And here punishment is understood as the process by which individuals come to feel stigmatized, outcast, shamed, defeated, or hopeless as a result of negative interactions and sanctions imposed by individuals who represent institutions of social control. And I want to take a minute here to highlight that that's us, right? The individuals who represent social control, that's us, right? These are people that represent schools, social workers, people that represent probation offices, probation entities, or prisons, people that represent the child welfare system. So when he's talking about this process of hypercriminalization, it's a process that happens by people like us. And so he also says that for the youth that he worked with, by the time that they formally entered the penal system, by the time that they were formally even on probation, they were already caught up in a cycle of what he calls hypercriminalization and punishment. And he says that the cycle begins before their first arrest. It starts as they're harassed, as they're profiled, as they're watched, and as they're disciplined at young ages before they even committed any crimes.
Bella, I guess while you're thinking of that, you're talking about this coming from a sociological perspective that kind of says, from this perspective, if we police or criminalize, there's chances that they're going to end up in this like very formal kind of place. And this is going to just tie directly into like core beliefs kind of coming from the clinical side, the mental health side. We'll get into a little later, but it's interesting that we're going to be speaking the same language here in a minute.
Right, exactly, right? So the ways that, as Victor Rios is saying, right, all of these messages that youth get about, yes, his book is so good. And he has a new one too. It came out a couple of years ago, but yeah, his work is really good. But thinking about, right, the ways that he talks about how it's these representative of social institutions that kind of harass, discipline, contain, surveil. And part of what he's saying is that it impacts the way that kids think about themselves. And that's what Ali is speaking to and we'll speak to eventually. But before we get there, I want to highlight, and if y'all have done any sessions with me before, you will already know this word because I talk about it every session. But in order for us as helpers to really do good work, to be able to understand the fullness of youth experiences and to do well by our communities, we have to approach all of the work that we do through an intersectional lens. And so intersectionality, it's a concept that was coined in the 80s by Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And really it argues that people all have overlapping identities and experiences with things like race, class, gender, sexuality, and any other number of identity categories. And this creates kind of these unique experiences with things like privilege and oppression. And in order for us to understand the experiences and to be able to help really the folks that we work with, it is crucial that we understand their wholeness. And so I know that intersectionality can feel really abstract. So we're going to play this quick little 48-second video.
Today we hear the call for full equality for women and distinctly for women of color from a multiplicity of perspectives. Intersectionality is a term we often hear, but what does it mean? Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989, explains it with a metaphor.
Consider an intersection made up of many roads. The roads are the structures of race, gender identity, class, sexuality, disability. And the traffic running through those roads are the practices and policies that discriminate against people. Now, if an accident happens, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. So if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from discrimination from any or all directions.
So really here, what intersectionality is trying to tell us is that people have experiences with both privilege and oppression. And if we can work to understand their experiences, then we can be better helpers. And especially when working with youth, right? Especially youth of color, when we're looking at things like gender and sexuality, it is crucial for us to understand how the youth that we're working with aren't only dealing with racism, but if they're girls, they're probably also dealing with racialized sexism. And intersectionality really gives us a frame to be able to talk about that.
When we're speaking of intersectionality and kind of looking at these categories, or, I think depending where you're at and what you're seeing, we may see kind of like disparities that happen, right? I think living in Santa Barbara County with largely like white and Latino populations, I see a lot of how race and class can impact like school and the way that they're kind of treated by like these forms of power, right? Like teachers, counselors. So that is just kind of something I've seen in my work of like how intersectionality, like race and class, can really, change the way a teacher or principal is going to respond to a student. But I want to pause here and just kind of see if anyone has kind of ever experienced that or has noticed any like disparities in their own work or in their own community.
Yeah, what are y'all seeing? Because I know that you all see this in ways that we may not even think of. So what does it look like in the work that you're doing? And while y'all are thinking of examples, please feel free to drop them in the chat. You can raise your hand if you feel comfortable speaking. But while y'all are thinking of that, I'm going to share one of the examples that comes up a lot in the work that we do. Like Ali said, we work in Santa Barbara County. So the kind of racial makeup of our county, there's a lot of, it's largely white or Latinx communities. And the Latinx communities that are here, we think about Santa Barbara and it's a tourist space, right? But a lot of the Latinx community members here are the workers that make that tourist space even possible. And so when we're working with youth here, they're growing up in this space that isn't only really racialized, but it's also very class, right? There are huge class disparities that exist within, they exist everywhere, but in Santa Barbara County, they are especially prominent. So one of the things that we see with the kids that we work with is the ways that when they're kids in elementary school, they're still excited about school. They're still really interested in it. And then as soon as they start hitting middle school and high school, there's this kind of less interest in school. I don't want to do school. I don't like school. And we started exploring it. And what we found that was happening was that once they hit middle school, the teachers started sending them messages that they were inadequate, right? That they couldn't keep up with the material, that maybe they needed to be in lower classes instead of figuring out the support that this student needed to be able to maintain, pace with their classmates. The comments that the teachers would make were, well, maybe you should look at trade school, which isn't a bad thing, but it made those kids feel like, well, that means that academia isn't for me. That means that they don't see me as somebody that's worthy of going to college. How is it coming up in y'all's life?
I guess I'll kind of speak to just one more quickly about, kind of like Bella is saying, there's, a lot of like Latino young boys here who are, coming from working class families. And so there is like not a lot to do outside unless you have some money. And so there's a group of boys who started a biking club where they just bike in the neighborhood. They do cool tricks, but they started having like a group of them, about maybe 15, 20 of them. And then we saw an article in one of the newspapers out here that described them as like hoodlums and, just running the streets. And it was like Really? Because I see it as like these kids have found a way to like have fun and not get into quote trouble. So that was just kind of something that's like, oh, interesting in the way that we're already like kind of framing that activity of bike riding with your friends on a group of brown boys as like delinquents.
They called them a bike gang. They
Yeah,
said bike gang forms in downtown Santa Barbara. And it's these
that's what it
cute,
was, bike gang.
they're preteens and teenagers who go around riding their bikes together, just having fun. They like pop wheelies and stuff. And yeah, and all of the comments under there were talking about how they were hoodlums on bikes and all of these things. Instead of seeing these kids as resourceful, right? Wanting community and wanting connection and creating it for themselves, they were kind of framed in these really deviant ways, right? As criminal instead of as youth looking for connection.
Oh, yeah.
All right, y'all. Y'all are tired. That's okay. There we go, Callie.
We have some time at the end too to get into this stuff.
But Callie says, I work with a lot of young boys that struggle with vulnerability. I think a lot of them are challenged with cultural gender expression and only feeling allowed to express themselves through anger a lot of the time. This is so real. I teach at UCSB, and one of the things that I kind of preface my classes with is a conversation about how when we're talking about things like patriarchy, patriarchy doesn't just impact girls, right? It's something that has an impact on everybody, regardless on gender. And one of the ways that we see it impacting people that are socialized as boys is this kind of disconnection from their emotional well-being, right? We raise boys that are so disallowed from being their full selves. Right? Even when you're not in a household that tells you not to cry, the messages that you get from the outside world are that you shouldn't be vulnerable, that your only kind of access to emotion is anger. And what this means, especially for racialized boys who are already seen as angry, can be really kind of dangerous for them.
So kind of while we're talking about youth and kind of how or ways that they can be criminalized or get these messages, it in a clinical lens, what I see is the development of core beliefs, right? So core beliefs are our most basic assumptions about your identity in the world, and are formed during our childhood. And they affect our lives and our actions as an adult moving forward, right? Ideally, if we grow up and we have positive core beliefs, we got messages that were like, we're good, you're going to be a good person through family, friends, schools, institutions. The more positive messages we receive, the more positive core beliefs we have, the more realistic we are going to be in our own lives with our own goals, and the more flexible we can be. But I find, and what we see is that with negative core beliefs, right, we see that a lot of the behavior that comes from negative core beliefs is really driven by fear, and it's very restricted, right? And so we're kind of talking about seeing this with boys who struggle with vulnerability, and kind of talking about Victor Rios's book kind of pushed in the school to prison pipeline. Like as a clinician working with this age group, I see how the interactions students have kind of impact their core belief, and then so are impacting the way they're kind of viewing their life, right? So I'll get very common male, 12-year-old, 13-year-old male who's coming to therapy for the first time. And, there's a lot of anxiety of like, I don't know what I'm going to do in my future. I don't know if I'm capable. I don't know if I'm good. And kind of as we talk, it's like, oh, all of these messages have come from like school systems. And what that means for that individual at that age is like, I don't want to go to school. I think I'm just going to like stay home, and I'm going to stay home and hang out with friends that are probably not going to school too. So it's like it again kind of increases the chance that they'll get caught up in a system, right? Or be criminalized formally by an institution. So I bring this here as the core beliefs to kind of tell you that this is where like we have so much power as helpers, as teachers, therapists, clinicians, probation officers. This is where we have power, right? That any youth we come into contact with, we have a chance to kind of rewire these narratives or these messages they've received about themselves in hopes of changing that so that they can be adults that feel a little bit more confident and comfortable in the world. So I bring in here those core beliefs. Obviously, this is like much more complicated, but for now we just need to know that like these beliefs that we get from the world will impact the way we see ourselves, right? If I don't feel worthy or I don't feel smart enough because of things people have told me, then the chance that I'm going to apply to a college or want to apply to a job, those things reduce when that happens. So on the bottom piece here, I have 2 stages of development that these were created by Erik Erikson. His theory is best known for like the psychosocial development and the concept of identity for humans, right? And so I bring these 2 in here because these are the ages we're talking about, that's 6 to 18, and again, probably older as well. But from 6 to 11, these youth are kind of integrating into society, right? They're starting school, so they need to feel that they are good. So they ask, like, how can I be good, right? We need structure at this time. We need predictability. We need tangible things that are going to help them feel competent, successful, and like they can achieve things. Then, kind of going from that 12 to 18, we're looking at the kind of identity being formated at this time. So who am I? Where am I going? And again, this is where I'll get kids with anxiety or depression, like I'm just not good enough. I'm not meant for college. I don't even know what to do. And again, it's all of these messages that have impacted them. So I bring these 2 here to say, like, this is where our magic is. This is like, if we can kind of reshape these beliefs, kind of reshape the experiences they have, then we're overall kind of doing the work that we want to be doing here today. Bella, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to say on that.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that, when we think about criminalization, this is really thinking about aspects of criminalization that are interpersonal, right? So the ways that we as helpers can intervene to kind of shift core beliefs so that youth aren't growing up with ideas about themselves as less than, as inadequate. And we also know that criminalization, while it happens on the interpersonal, it's also a systemic thing, right? There are going to be ways that youth are criminalized that we have very little control over. And so then part of why this is so important is because it's up to us to figure out in our role, even as we know that there are going to be moments of criminalization that we can't control, how can we intervene in the spaces that we're able to? And this is one of the ways that we can. I know that there are going to be ways, things that happen that there's no ways for us to stop. We're not going to be able to stop all of the ways that youth are criminalized because it's about a larger system. But there are kind of interpersonal, everyday, quotidian ways that we can intervene into these harmful systems. And I'm sure that y'all already do pretty often already.
In kind of sharing with y'all that I've been kind of doing this clinical work here for 8 years, and kind of working with this population, this age group, I've come to kind of develop my own set of kind of skills or strategies that I use to help minimize or rewire these messages. And I wanted to share that all with you today, and also hear your guys' like perspective and what strategies you might use to, again, minimize the criminalization or the hyper criminalization that the youth are going to face. So we'll go over to the next slide. So these examples that I'm going to share here are kind of pulled from my personal experience and also my clinical work here. So strategies from the field. So when I think of like, as kind of an agent of the state, a social worker, a therapist coming in, I'm always thinking about, okay, how can I minimize the bad experiences that they've had, right? How can I make them kind of want to stay engaged or get a different experience? So the first thing we kind of hit throughout, which was the intersectional analysis, kind of understanding the youth's kind of as a whole person, right? So if I have a youth, I'm looking at race, I'm looking at, okay, what have you been told about race? What are some things you've heard about, like your social economic status, your education, your religion, your culture, all of these things, kind of what messages have you heard? So kind of being individualized in that approach can help. But secondly, the second one I want to hit is psychoeducation. So again, we talk about like the ways that we're policed for various different things, whether it's gender expression, our sexuality, the way we engage in public spaces, but we also see this all the time. There is a criminalization of mental health, symptoms, trauma responses that we have. And so often in this work, it is they're crazy, they're combative, they're resistant. And so all of these words that we use, they're manipulative, they're liars, they're condescending, all of this language that we use to describe what could easily be described through like a PTSD diagnosis, for example, has power, right? So in a lot of the work that I do, I make sure that not only am I educating myself on what I'm working with, but also making sure the youth or the person has the language to understand their own experience, helping family and friends, those that are a part of this person's life, understand, so that we're not pathologizing this behavior. We're not, creating messages of, oh, you're just bad. It's like, no, you're actually combating things. And when I think of this, I was kind of mind blown. I had an 18-year-old female. She had been in foster care in her younger years, and she came to me 8 months ago with the initial kind of like, I'm depressed, anxious. It ended up being PTSD, but she said, like, I don't have friends, I'm not happy anymore, and I'm just kind of working at this job to make ends meet because I don't know what I want to do moving forward with my career. Well, as I kind of got to know her a little bit, I came to find that everything she wanted, she stopped herself from, because she felt like, I'm bad, I'm a horrible person. So she wanted to be a nurse. And I remember saying, like, well, why don't you become a nurse? That'd be great. And she said, well, because I'm a bad person, like I've done bad things. I'm a really awful person. I'm a monster. And I'm like, whoa, like, well, let's weigh out the validity there. How much of this is true? And she's describing it to me, and I'm like, oh my God. So I was like, this is PTSD. This is that alternate cognition and perception of self. This is that intense feeling of shame and guilt, and I'm bad. And so she was like, oh my God. So anyway, here we are 8 months later, and I can tell you she applied for nursing school, and she's like, yeah, who better than me? And she's worked through, like, I'm not bad. I guess you're right. I'm not a bad person. Right. So that psychoeducation really helps us kind of undo maybe these messages that have all been done. So psychoeducation, huge, especially for boys, kind of who can be, a little bit more aggressive because they don't understand their emotions, right? Some of that irritability and anxiety of like, oh, I'm stressed about my future, and it's coming out as irritability. So in that psychoeducation, we're not only giving like them the language, but also those around them, so that they're not being pathologized. So that's kind of like that psychoeducation piece. Another one is like being conscientious of notes and documentation. Ooh, okay. So on an interpersonal level, it is important that we be mindful of the language, because when youth read our notes or get their documents, they are reading this and getting messages about themselves. And in working with foster youth, and myself included as a foster youth, I can tell you, when I was like 12 and going to court and getting my court papers, I read, that I was manipulative and a liar because I told the court my dad was going to get me back. I don't know why I said that, but now that I think back, I'm like, maybe that's what I wanted to believe at that time. Right. But I remember reading that, manipulative and a liar. And I just thought, wow. So those things, those words we use in documentation, just kind of looking at it like, if they read this, what would they think? And how would that impact them, can be really important. But also, it's not only for their eyes, but beyond that interpersonal piece, we also are representatives of the state. So as helpers, sometimes our notes are given to state agents like social workers, probation officers, law enforcement. And the language that we have in there can sometimes be used to further criminalize the youth we work with. So one way that we can buffer that criminalization is by, again, being mindful of the language we use in that documentation. I remember when I worked for Wraparound, I had to write updates every week and send it to the probation officer and the social worker. And when I was new, I remember I wanted to write like, kid relapsed, or like was triggered and relapsed. And my supervisor called me in and said, before you send this email, like I want you to think about what you're saying. And this is going to a probation officer. So what's that going to sound like? And so it was like, you can say that they are struggling with their addiction, because relapse is a part of recovery. And so instead of saying, relapse, and that was just it, it was, like person continues to work to maintain sobriety, and here's a plan for like when they get triggered with this feeling, right? So kind of showing the social worker or the probation officer that, hey, they're still working on their sobriety, and this is a trigger they found, and this is what they're going to do, as opposed to just saying they relapsed, right? And I think too, of working with like I've worked with girls who, mostly girls in this county, but who have been commercially and sexually exploited as children, so our CSEC population. Again, kind of being conscientious of the words and the language we use in those notes, right? I remember as a supervisor, I was reviewing an assessment, and my staff had wrote that the child, like the kid was promiscuous, right? And this girl was actually being trafficked by her parents for rent. And so it's like, that's not promiscuity. So again, let's be conscious of that word, because this girl has actually been groomed and is being like assaulted in these situations. So I don't think it's like promiscuity that's going on there. So just kind of those ways of being mindful of our language. Also like transparency. Again, I work with teens and in a therapy, and I can't tell you how many youth I've had come in that have had therapy before, and I'm like, do you need me to review informed consent and mandated reporting? And they're like, what do you mean? And then I tell them, and they're like, oh my God, right? Like, oh, thank you for telling me. Because I want them to feel good, right? If they're like 11, that 6 to 11 age, I want to be transparent with them, because they need to know like what they say may be a report. She's 15 now, but I had a girl tell me like she hated therapy, and her dad would be so mad at her for being in therapy. And when we got into why, she said, well, when I was 9 years old, I went to my school counselor and kind of told them what was going on. She's like, and then I got home, and when I got home, my dad was being arrested, and my mom and my dad were telling me it's all my fault and I'm bad. And so even at 15, she still has this core belief that she's bad because she got her dad locked up. And so I know now at 15, that was a therapy session where I had to like validate that, like, you were 9, you did not know that information was going to be kind of reported. You were not prepared for what to expect when you got home, and you're 9 years old. So you're looking at how do I be good? Well, she kind of like to her parents, right? You're a bad kid for doing that. So we have to be transparent with our youth. I think, especially when I see, suicidal, homicidal behavior, like I have to be transparent with that. I get youth that are like saying they want to kill themselves, and then right, they're coming into therapy in crisis, and there's honest discussions about them that if you say this language, here's what I'm going to have to do. And every time I do that, you're going to have to go through this process. And with that, there's like, oh, well, I don't want that to happen. And then we'll kind of talk about, okay, well, how do we build our distress tolerance? So I've kind of seen that there, but also I think with brown youth, right? Like in Santa Barbara County, I've had a few youth, one particularly, go to campus with just kind of, he didn't even have a gun in his backpack, but he was overheard by a teacher that said he had a gun in his backpack. And he got suspended. They went to his house and searched his whole house for this gun, never found it. And he was kind of like upset about it. And I remember telling him, like, look, like, first of all, saying you have a gun on a campus right now with everything that's going on and how serious this is, like, yes, you're going to expect some consequences. There's going to be cops at your door. So, and he was like, oh, wow, okay, well, yeah, I guess I won't have that, right? So it was a discussion about transparency and not shaming him, because his mom and the school and his friends, where everyone was like giving him this bat. And it's like, yes, definitely not the smartest thing to say, but I don't need to make you feel dumb about it. I don't need to make you feel like you were horrible for doing this, but instead I need you to understand the severity of why this is kind of important.
And
But
when we're thinking about, sorry, Ali, when we're thinking about the 100% transparency, keep in mind, right, that very often we're working with youth that are either on probation or in foster care. So they've already had the kind of autonomy in their lives removed. And so often, you know, we don't think about kids and youth as being deserving of things like agency and autonomy, but they are full humans, right? And so giving them 100% transparency also gives them these kind of small pockets of autonomy under this incredibly constraining system, right? It allows them to decide, okay, when is it okay? When does it feel good for me to bring in outside help for maybe a situation that I'm dealing with at home? Because we all know that even when we do put in a report, it doesn't always make the situation better. In fact, we've had so many situations that have been made significantly worse by reports. And so being 100% transparent with youth gives them the kind of opportunity to decide and to prepare for the consequences or for the ramifications that they may be dealing with at home for sharing that information with a mandated reporter. So we have this kind of, you know, I know that it's a really hard line to toe. It's a really difficult line to toe, but the transparency that we have with the people that we work with is such a powerful tool in navigating that kind of difficult line of being a mandated reporter. Sorry, Ali, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. And the last two, strength-based, right? I think we all do this, and it's been kind of encouraged if you're a social worker too, to be strength-based, but don't underestimate that. For even when a youth tells you some crisis or some off-the-wall situation that went on, there is like something we can say about that is strength-based. But I'll say being strength-based isn't just like in this practice here with the patient or the person you're working with. Personally, I think we get better at this the more we do it outside. So I say to be strength-based is not just like a work skill, it is like a way of life, right? And I get so many youth who are coming in with already receiving messages that I'm bad, or I'm not smart, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy, or I'm not going to go to college. And so finding ways to build their kind of view of self in a positive way. So, you know, something as simple as like, you know, it sounds like you had a hard week, but you're here today because you're open to the help, right? You're here, you're showing up, you're doing the work, even if it feels like not anything's happening. So yeah, I mean, I think we're all doing this one, but just again, you can't go wrong with being strength-based in wraparound. It is part of like the core, like the principles that we're supposed to work with is being strength-based. And I can't tell you how many families I worked with where in the beginning it was, nothing's going right in our family. And then it's like, oh, you guys had dinner together. Oh, you got an A on this math paper. And next thing you know, I have families by the time they were graduating where like everything's going well, even though there's like these little bit of concerns. So kind of being strength-based helps build self-esteem, gives reframes to the things they're going through. And if they're navigating mental health symptoms like depression and anxiety, sometimes it really is hard for them to see the positive, or they'll hear something and be like, yeah, they said I was great, but what I heard is I'm stupid, right? So giving those reframes. The last one, we have some other trainings on that too, but safety planning with youth and families. This is like the number one thing here that keeps from going to institution like psychiatric wards, facilities, holds, as well as getting like law enforcement and social workers involved.
And yeah, feel free to email us if you have more questions about that. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.